Hello, everyone. Welcome to AI4. Our next panel is titled The State of AI in Healthcare. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the virtual stage as they turn on their cameras. And we're going to have an awesome panel. Sophia, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll start with a couple of introductions. Ylan, would you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, Ylan Kazi. I'm the Vice President of Data Science and Machine Learning for UnitedHealth Group, and I lead a team of data scientists that focus on improving healthcare outcomes for Medicare members and patients.
Perfect. And then we've got two Marks. So Mark Ostrowski, would you mind going ahead and introducing yourself?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Sophia. Mark Ostrowski, I'm Head of Engineering for Checkpoint Software. I head up the, like I mentioned, the East Coast engineering team. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Seraphim. I'm a machine learning engineer at GraphCore, and so we've built the first purpose-built hardware for machine learning, a graph-based processor, and I focus on our healthcare vertical.
Awesome. And Vishal?
Hi, everyone. My name is Vishal Sheth. I'm Director of Transformation at York-Presbyterian Hospital. I oversee our transformation efforts across the enterprise with oversight over AI, automation, robotics, and web dev and mobile teams. The purpose of our group is to improve hospital outcomes, patient experience, and obviously financial outcome as well for the organization.
Perfect. So I am Sophia Saleem. I'm a medical information officer over at Mount Sinai Hospital. I also work in telemedicine as the director of telemedicine and teleconsults for the system. And I am very much looking forward to talking to you guys and seeing, what you guys are doing in AI for healthcare. So a quick question, yes or no question to start with. Do you agree that healthcare is in the midst of an inevitable AI-driven transformation? So this is kind of an interesting question, actually. I don't know if Ylan, you want to take that away, or you want to start, the conversation?
Sure. I would say definitely yes.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think as with the recent pandemic, it's obvious that technology is going to become more paramount in healthcare. And so, I feel like we are going to see AI take a more center role in that transformation. Vishal, I know you probably have a lot of experience at New York Presby, and would love to hear your experience there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the short answer is absolutely. I don't think there's any industry that will not be impacted by AI, and obviously a lot of these emerging technologies that come through. Unfortunately, healthcare tends to be a laggard in these types of situations, but definitely the transformation is inevitable, and certainly that's what we're experiencing within our institution as well. Obviously, for those who are not familiar, we're top 4 ranked hospital in the nation. We're affiliated with, two amazing academic institutions, Columbia and Cornell. So our goal is always be at the forefront of healthcare and leveraging technology as much as we can to improve the overall experience that we provide to our patients, improve outcomes, and effectively provide the best care that we can probably provide the communities we serve. So technology is an integral part of what we do. So we're fortunate enough that we were certainly one of the leaders in the space when we started out 2 years ago, but it's still a tough fight. It's still a conversation that can be quite challenging sometimes. Certainly when we started the journey, then these were very novel or new concepts that we had, 2, 3 years ago. But certainly, at least within our institution, now this has become part of the way we operate. And as we think about what will kind of the organizations look like moving forward 2 to 5 years down the line, it's just going to be a natural part of any kind of solution you have. Similar to how you think about software, you don't necessarily think about it as a innovative or cool technology. Same thing with the mobile applications, so on and so forth. I fundamentally believe AI too will become so indistinguishable from your traditional softwares that it'll just become part of what you do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. It encompasses a lot of the insecurities that healthcare as an industry has with technology. And, it really, there's a lot of, risk and patient safety involved. And so that ends up being discussed first. Is this safe? And I know we're probably going to dig into some of these complex topics on this conversation. But there's definitely a lot of factors that have held the healthcare industry back from adopting technology. And, with this, it is inevitable. I agree that this is definitely coming. And we look forward to the innovation. I think the idea of what is our future state going to look like is still so intangible. So it's kind of hard to work towards that. Oftentimes when we have a project in technology, we know what we want to get to, but a lot of this is not really defined. And so it's a little bit harder to really map out our steps because we don't know exactly where we're going. But I think we have some industry leaders here today to help us and have those discussions. So our next question is, COVID-19 appears to be a catalyst for accelerated technology and analytic adoption. Is that your experience to date, and how do you see AI adoption being impacted? So kind of want to hear from some of our industry leaders as well. Mark, do you have any thoughts on that? And how has this really changed the development side of, AI solutions for healthcare?
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely jump in. I think it's just like the first question, it's an obvious yes, right?
Yeah.
That, obviously it's, the pandemic has brought forward really the requirement for the adoption of technology in a quick way. So, and I don't think the healthcare industry is anything different than other verticals. So whether that's remote access, whether that's acceleration to the cloud adoption, which I know is something slightly different when we talk about healthcare, but there's no doubt that we've seen a rapid adoption. And I'd actually bring up one example that I had actually overseas early on in the pandemic, when I actually had a hospital reach out to us and ask for the ability to create remote access into medical equipment to treat patients from remote, not being inside the institution itself. And as part of that, obviously there was huge security, cybersecurity concerns because of that, both for the access to the hospital, but also the fact that all the devices that were, treating patients were all IP enabled, and the whole concept of IoT became very, very, very quickly, in the forefront of their cybersecurity program. So I think that's just one example, which I'm sure that was not the only example that we've seen across this industry, but it only highlights that, that this pandemic has both accelerated it, but has also highlighted where the gaps may be relative to security, and that we have to be able to fill those gaps so that we can give a good, obviously, patient treatment, but also do it in a secure way, which we can be assured that, anybody trying to do harm, which to me sounds crazy, but it's happening, that they're unable to do so. So I definitely think it's been a big change.
No, I think that's a very important point of all of this, and having your insight here is really critical, because you can't really have this discussion without talking about security. So I agree. And then Mark from GraphCore, I apologize, I don't know your last name. Can you say it so that when I call Mark, I know which Mark I'm speaking to?
Yeah, for sure. Like, my last name is Seraphim, like the baby.
Seraphim, that's right. I saw it earlier and I didn't remember, so I apologize. So would you mind also weighing in on kind of your thoughts on how COVID has really accelerated the development?
Of course, yeah. So really, like the way we personally think about this problem is that, like, we've had, for example, this collaboration with Microsoft on being able to diagnose chest X-rays for whether they have COVID or not using machine learning. And so the idea is, typically when you look at these large models that work on like very high density images, they can be very slow to train, and they can be very slow to actually get an inference, to actually get a prediction. And so, like, on this specific project with Microsoft, we were able to increase like our training time by 8x and then our inference time by 3x. So like, whereas a model, let's say, would take a week to train, now it takes about a day. And instead of taking, a day to train, now it takes a couple of hours. And so for anything that's really time critical, like the way I think of this isn't necessarily like you're going to have some sort of machine learning researcher just, spit in some data and then get a nice model out. It's sort of like the doctor needs to interactively test out their assumptions, see what works, like fix the model. And so this is where making the model really fast makes it interactive and it makes it better. And this is especially crucial, like, like another point which the other Mark brought, which is that, like you want things to be remote, like you want people to be able to diagnose things more quickly. You don't have enough doctors, so any tools that we can provide them to make better decisions faster. We're happy.
You're saying all the things that I was going to say. I mean, exactly. Ylan, any other, insight and any other anecdotal stories from, your experience with COVID and the acceleration of your development?
Sure. I think with COVID-19, one of the areas, I agree with everything that's been said around just accelerating the trend forward. I think the other thing that it really challenged, my organization on, and I'm sure all the panelists, was how do you really utilize many of these machine learning algorithms in a rapidly changing environment? And in particular, having data that was essentially suspect, right? I think initially, early on, you had testing that I think in many cases was opaque. So, certain states were doing it better than others. You also had to worry about the overall denominator for tests changing pretty rapidly. And that can be an absolute nightmare for machine learning because you're essentially having a rapidly changing training set. But I think it really challenged our organization and specifically, my team of data scientists to figure out techniques that, they may have learned in academia or that they had just, tried on the side and actually have to implement them in a live production environment in order for us to really help people and help patients with their health.
Yeah. And Vishal, I'm going to speak for you because I'm sure you had the same experience. Things that were happening in hospitals that took maybe months to years normally were happening in days. And so it sounds like that didn't just happen in a hospital setting. It happened in any industry that touched hospitals. We were moving at light years, faster compared to how we normally operate. And so I think it's a resounding yes. COVID-19 significantly impacted how we see things and view things in technology and operationalize things in the hospital. So all really good thoughts. Next question. Okay, so in such a highly regulated environment as a hospital, are there AI applications you'd like to use but you can't due to regulation? I would really love to hear Vishal's perspective on this because I know that this is definitely something that we all sort of have to deal with when we're operationalizing these tools. So yeah, let me know your experience and I'd love to share mine.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't know if I'll be able to answer directly because realistically, I think in healthcare, we're still barely scratching the surfaces of all the potential applications that you have. Having said that, I think we haven't come across those situations yet where we're on the outer bounds of all the things we can do, and we've hit this kind of wall where we're hitting the issue of privacy versus the benefit, or regulations versus kind of what you're trying to do, et cetera, and so we haven't come across that yet. But there's a different way I can answer that question is in terms of how thoughtful we've been in terms of what use cases we select and how do we expand from there. So so we started our journey about 2.5 years ago. We recognized that this is something that we need to invest significant amount of time and effort into it. This is certainly going to be a technology that's going to disrupt us. So we need to try to do as much as we can to disrupt ourselves. And one of the first places we recognize that this type of technology makes the most sense is in non-clinical area for a number of different reasons.
Yeah.
It's low-hanging fruits, very little risk, and the value can be easily quantified. So we took a deliberate approach of going into that area with the expectation that as you kind of start tackling these low-hanging fruits, you can start developing a particular portfolio around that with the ultimate goal of going to the clinical care as well.
Yeah.
It's, we're fortunate enough now, we're in that space now where it's been 2.5 years. We have a very healthy portfolio of non-clinical projects. And we're starting a similar journey now in the clinical care as well. So there's things like heart failure, predicting patients that are at risk for heart failure, predicting patients that are at risk for malnutrition. Those are things that we're trying to do. But I'm sure, once you start going down that line, you will start hitting this kind of nexus of, is the trade-off worth it, right? If you can't explain it, or if there's an ambiguity, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I know, like from and Mark Ostrowski, I'd love to hear, actually from you and get your thoughts. Have you had any conversations, with clients or hospitals that, have mentioned, well, we can't really do that, that's not really something that we can implement, and, how do we get around that? Are we protected? What have you had any conversations like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it comes up almost immediately. And I think, with your opening statements, right, that hospitals seem to always be a little bit slower. Maybe Vishal mentioned that, it's tough for a hospital to accelerate at the same level as some verticals just because of the high amount of regulations. So very often we get that exact question, right? Whether it's tied to AI and machine learning or not, right? It's, if we do use that specific way of determining your cyber risk profile, what are the implications to specific regulations? Like, so I'll use a very generic HIPAA one, right? That's always like the first question is, right, all right, well, does that particular platform, right, does it have reporting for specific compliance regulations, right? So before they even move to a technology decision, it's how can I take that specific infrastructure that I may be accelerating, adoption of, but can I do real-time compliance reports? And that those compliance reports are exactly what I think auditors and administrators look for before they make a move. When they think about, again, accelerating maybe, a specific IoT usage, or maybe they are doing specific things within Microsoft and Azure, right, with cloud usage and AI. Can we go back to that specific, Microsoft Azure environment and be sure that that cloud environment does abide by, specific compliance guidelines? So it's always like if it's not the first question, it's the second question. And then we have to be sure from a cybersecurity perspective that the answer is yes. Here's the visibility, and here's the visibility in real time. Because a report from last week looks nothing like a report from the following week, like you mentioned, right? I'm sure you guys made changes during COVID because you had to, and the security and the reporting and the compliance has to be able to move with that same speed to support you guys from a staff perspective.
Yeah. No, I mean, we definitely, we always end up pulling in, our legal compliance, even our billing teams together almost weekly to discuss these technologies and what would stick and what wouldn't. And so, a lot of times the regulations do kind of outweigh how easy it would be to implement some of this technology. For us, we try to, again, like going back to that future state, we try to envision what our future state is, should look like. Where should we, to Vishal's point, where should we actually move our AI efforts, whether it's clinical or non-clinical, and where it makes the most impact for our patients. And so I think that those discussions are still ongoing. And, as the, not only the regulations from a, compliance standpoint, but also federal, and state laws about, privacy and data sharing, I think are also, come into play. Who can participate? Can this be reimbursed? All these questions are still kind of up in the air. So for us, like, we're definitely still navigating really uncertain waters right now. And it really won't become, more mainstream until, more people get involved, to be honest. I think that's when people start really deciding, okay, this is our standard of how we're going to operate, this kind of technology. Vishal, go ahead. I see.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I can expand on that a little bit, right? It also speaks to the kind of the structure and the governance kind of framework that you have established. So within our institution, particularly, any kind of effort that we tackle, it's truly interdisciplinary, not only in terms of engaging the appropriate business owners and adjacent functions that have a stake into the conversation, but broadly speaking, we also have legal, infosec, traditional IT teams, compliance team, part of this governance process, HR as well, part of this governance process. They're helping us to make sure that when we are tackling these projects, that if there are guardrails that need to be put on something, there's a framework through which they can always be apprised of what we're doing, and then two, they can be responsible and reactive enough in the moment to say, you need to be careful of A, B, and C. So as I said, fortunately, because of the structure we've set up and perhaps the use cases we've tackled, we haven't come across that. But as you think about, starting to go on more on those edge cases, that structure becomes really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it kind of lends to, you've got, Mark, and you've got Ylan, you guys are developing products, but at the same time, we in the hospital side have to develop our own kind of quote product, meaning like our service, like what we're offering, whether it's a patient, the provider, the system. So we're developing a product within our framework, our regulatory framework, our legal framework. And so marrying those two up in the same place often can become difficult because, Ylan, I'd love to hear from you, what your experience has been, but, when you work with hospital systems, they have to develop that framework and that governance structure Vishal is talking about and have a really solid one before they can really bring in the technology. I feel like they need to establish that in advance, because when you bring in the technology and then on the round, coming back around and saying, oh, what does compliance think about it? It's really not a good investment of anyone's time. It just becomes a mess, and it doesn't really get, supported properly to be implemented, wide stream. So Ylan, what are your experiences there?
Yeah, I think everyone brings up really good points around it. And I think even, just from a baseline level, whenever you're bringing in any type of machine learning solution, whether it is right into a hospital or having clinicians that are using it, there's always going to be that initial skepticism. You're working with probably some of the most highly educated people in the world, right? Doctors, nurses, other clinicians, and having a machine learning model in place that supposedly can predict a certain disease better than a physician can, I think can be very off-putting at first. But I think, really bringing people along and ensuring that everybody has a baseline understanding of what machine learning does and how it can be helpful, I think is usually a better starting point, because I think what we found is that it's not necessarily replacement of any people or clinicians, but it's really augmenting it and still having, the clinical judgment as the final decision point. And I think that's very important, particularly in healthcare, because we can't work like Facebook does, right? We can't just create an ad, target somebody, and then, oh, shoot, it was the wrong ad, big deal, right? I think in a clinical setting, that could potentially put a patient's life at risk. So I think there's just a lot of differences between AI and healthcare versus other industries. But I think part of that is just the reality that you're dealing with people's lives. And, we do have to figure out, how do you continue to balance innovation with all of the regulatory pressures that exist?
Yeah, there's got to be that handshake. And it's good that we're having forums like this so those handshakes can occur more often, and we can really discuss, like, this is our concern, and how can you help us address it as developers? So that's great. Mark, Seraphim, is there any other comment that you had?
Yeah, for sure. Like, so basically, like, my observation, because like I used to be in the natural language processing world in my past life, and sort of, I think one of my main observations in healthcare is that the cost of a mistake is a lot higher. So typically in machine learning, like, you think, oh, like, I have a 99.9% accuracy, like, that's great, I deserve a raise. However, in healthcare, that means like there's like actually, exactly how many people are getting the wrong diagnosis and potentially dying as a result. And so so the way we think about this is that ultimately, like, the same way that doctors, like, use tests, like, you don't feel someone's blood to do something, like, you don't use your instinct there, like you use like some other technology to make better decisions. We view this as being very similar. And obviously, like, like stuff like privacy becomes even more critical. And so whether you want something on-prem, whether you want to use differential privacy to do some sort of aggregation statistics, if you want to share data between hospitals, like whatever you want to do with machine learning, you know, like we definitely want to support, and we think it's critical, and it's more so critical than any other vertical I can think of.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's interesting because we are marrying up kind of the art of medicine, you know, where the doctor has some intuition involved, some experience that, you know, maybe AI doesn't have. So you do have to marry that up and then include the regulations. So there's a lot going on there. I agree. And I think it's still just very nebulous what our future state's going to be, but we're all recognizing that it's going to happen. So
it's sort of recognizing the strength of humans versus like robots. Like, let's say, I've been learning a lot about like protein sequencing lately, and it's not like a human can look at a protein sequence and be like, aha, you know, this is what this does.
Yeah.
So it's very similar.
Yes. No, exactly. All right. Maybe next question. All right. What is your most significant use case for AI to date and its impact? This is a great question. Okay, so I will maybe start with, I guess, Vishal, maybe we can start with you and then take it away.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, by default, a lot of what I will speak to, at least today, will be most likely non-clinical, because clinical ones, we're still too early to call those clear successes yet, because we will need more data to actually drive those conclusions. But in terms of non-clinical areas, the two kind of domains that have, where we found the most value, one is revenue cycle, and the second one is access. So I'll speak to a little bit more specifically about revenue cycle. So within revenue cycle, we had one specific use case where we were, there's a process called clinical appeals process. So what happens is once a patient is discharged, obviously you're submitting a claim on behalf of the patients to the payer. Payers are reviewing that, and based on their adjudication, they're providing some sort of a response to it. And that sometimes, they're providing denials. Actually, not sometimes. A lot of times there could be a denial associated with it. And those denials could be provided in two different forms. One of them could be technical denial, and the other one is a clinical denial. So clinical denial is essentially making a conclusion on medical merit of that case. So we have a very specific process, as I'm sure many other hospitals would have, where we have groups of nurses who are responsible for, writing those appeal letters. So one of the things we noticed when we took on this project was, over the course of the past several years, our clinical appeal success rates have been trending downwards. Now that means because payers are also becoming very aggressive in terms of what they're approving versus what they're not approving. And as a result, obviously there's an industry trend, but at the same time, we wanted to see, is there an opportunity for us to either slow down that trend or actually turn it the other way entirely. So what we did there was we recognized that each nurse has their own individual strengths. So someone may be coming from pediatrics, someone may be coming from cardiology cases. So our goal was trying to figure out, is there a way for us to improve the overall success rate by assigning the right case to the right person? What was happening traditionally was just first come, first serve. On average, nurses are doing 2 to 2.5 cases per day. So if we can just have a better optimization of the assignment, perhaps there is a way we can improve the overall success rate. So we were actually able to develop a model that was based on historical strengths of the nurses and how they have succeeded in the past. And based on that model, we would assign the next case, who is the right person to take this on, and obviously factoring in the load balancing and so on and so forth as well. And we were able to see tremendous results where we were able to improve our overall success rate by around 6% or so, and each percentage represents $1.5 million to $2 million.
Yeah.
That's a great example of how we did very little in terms of the workflow change. All we did was change the assignment. So there was, from a nurse standpoint, they didn't know any difference. All they had to do the same thing. Now they just were being assigned to the task that they were probably most likely to excel at. So that's an example of that. And we can get patient access as well at some point.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly, that like epitomizes like a very good success story, because the workflow doesn't change much. So it's almost seamless on the user end, right? They have really no idea what's happening, but their work seems to be getting easier because they're getting cases they're familiar with, and maybe they can churn out more cases as well. And maybe it's even more enjoyable at that point, because they're just familiar. So that's a great example of how, we would, we in healthcare would use AI, in a very successful way, where it's really not disrupting our current workflows. I'd love to hear from maybe Mark, if you have any other examples of, or what, you feel like is the most, premier use of AI, in recent memory for you.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
Oh, so yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Marco.
All right, want me to go first?
Sure.
All right, cool. Yeah, sorry, Mark. I think I can kind of bridge a couple of the talking points that the team's made so far. So I'll use Mark's example of using machine learning to help identify chest X-rays relative to COVID. I'll use your example of the importance of privacy, right, in healthcare. And what I'll say in general, again, I think maybe even, I'll make this point too, is that even cybersecurity, where obviously that's my expertise that I'm bringing to this panel. When we make a cybersecurity decision in other verticals, it's important, but with healthcare, it is a matter of life or death. Right. So if we make a cybersecurity decision on a piece of device that's supporting somebody's life and it's incorrect, it has really, really bad outcomes versus if it's on a cash register and then that machine goes down for a little while, the consequences aren't quite as dire. Right. So, so from an AI perspective, what we bring, what I feel like the security industry brings to the table is that we can leverage machine learning. We can, and Mark probably can build off this as well. Like our goal is to take as much data as we can from a cyber perspective, label it, right? Then be able to use that to learn the unlabeled data, right? To be able to give hospitals a really sound, very accurate cybersecurity prevention rate, so that we can protect all the equipment that exists in hospitals, but do it in a way where, number one, the patient's health is paramount, but two, we can do it in a way which a hospital can actually consume it. So if you think about a hospital with all the IoT devices, I mean, they're generating, hundreds of thousands of logs per week. How do you find the 10 or 15 hosts that are actually infected? You can't do that with the staff. You have to do that with machine learning and artificial intelligence, right? So yeah. I think you couldn't have said it better, right? Is that, Sophia, is that, we're finally seeing the marriage between technology and healthcare in a very, very open way. So we can take the best of technology and apply it to make it the healthcare scenario as best as possible. So that's kind of where, that's an example of where cyber overlaps with machine learning and AI, specifically into the healthcare vertical.
Yeah, no, that's a great application. And Mark S., I know you probably have like a very interesting application as well, and Ylan, so I'd love to hear from both of you guys. Go for it, Mark.
So I would say, like, at a high level, the most impactful, like, since that was the question, like the most impactful application we believe was the work with Microsoft around diagnosing chest X-rays with EfficientNet. However, like, I do also want to make the point that a lot of problems in healthcare are already sort of like well-formulated technical machine learning problems, and obviously there's like many like policy challenges to actually deploy them. But like as examples, and these are like all examples where we have existing customers doing this. Like, let's say you want to design new proteins. Like a protein is a sequence, so all the work in natural language processing around attention networks is relevant. When you think of like a medical diagnosis, that's sort of like a decision tree. It's like, well, you look at tests and then you make decisions on which next test to take. So again, like this is already a sort of machine learning problem. We talked about chest X-rays, like this is an example of an image classification. And finally, and what used to be more in the research community, but we've now seen like become very popular in industry, is work around graph neural networks. So funnily enough, like when I was looking at like, I don't know, toolkits to analyze, like let's say molecule toxicity, they would essentially treat it as a sequence and then try to predict the toxicity. However, like, one thing I'm excited about with our IPU is that like we can just natively work over a graph. So like a molecule is a graph, it's a sparse thing. So instead of having to sequence it, just embrace that it's sparse and do any sort of classification, regression, or generation that you want on it. And so these are sort of like the 4 problem domains that I already believe are very well formulated ML problems. And I think the challenge is more around like, how do you get this in the hands of doctors? Like, how do you make sure they're using it, that they're happy with it, that they can debug it, and not just like, let's say, have a cool problem on Kaggle that has very high accuracy, because I don't think that in of itself is as high impact as people think it is.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously like the opportunities are abound, and there's just so many applications, whether it's at the bedside or, at the bench, at the research bench. And so, or, in the back office, Vishal points out, it's like, how do we get these operationalized? Ylan, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Sure. I would say the biggest impact that we've seen is just across population health. So looking at diabetes, hypertension, many of these other chronic conditions, and really applying machine learning across millions of different patients to really help them improve their health outcomes. So I think that's where machine learning in particular in healthcare can really scale up relatively quickly, versus having clinicians need to make individual diagnoses, over an entire large panel. So I think from a scale standpoint, it's definitely helped. And, I would say the other thing, and this isn't, necessary to one use case, but just overall impact has been being able to implement these solutions and actually have them be used. It's pretty staggering, even in large organizations, how many different types of models are created and then they end up getting shelved. Like they can't be implemented, or there's issues with them. But I think really focusing on what can be implemented and how do you create that level of trust with your stakeholders, with your physicians, to be able to use it. And then I would just say lastly, a few years ago, deep learning was all the rage, and it's like, why don't we just apply deep learning to everything? And I think, that was obviously a mistake. But I think the various areas of machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, there are certain use cases where they really thrive in and are successful with. And I think that teams are really thinking more nuanced about it and trying to pick the best tool for the best job, and not worrying about hype in the industry.
Yeah, no, I think that there's definitely a lot more sophistication these days when, we're talking about AI and what technology we're using for which use case. As far as the implementation goes, and I agree with you, pop health is one of our areas that we're focusing on as well as some other diagnostic AI algorithms. And so we're just starting to kind of dip our toes in the water with service lines and applications, clinical applications that seem most enthusiastic about it, so that it doesn't feel like we're forcing it on anyone. But the truth is how do we operationalize this? And I think to Vishal's point, that was a beautiful example, given on, how do we operationalize AI such that the end user is not really even aware that, the AI is helping them, and actually just makes their jobs easier. So whether that means providing them more information, at the time of their decision making, to allow them to make a better decision, allowing clinicians to expedite a triage, for instance, more quickly, so they can take care of that patient faster before a doctor can arrive, or dealing with a back end office, or looking at massive amounts of data quickly, so that you can make decisions on patients faster without having to see that patient in an ER 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks before, you can make a decision and call the patient up and say, it looks like you are, a suspect for someone who's going to have uncontrolled, CHF, or, heart failure, diabetes, or you've not refilled your medication. I mean, there's lots of different applications there that seem very simple to capture, but when you're talking about large groups of people, it's very hard. So these are all really, really good points. Okay, so maybe next question. Great. How is AI included in your company strategy? Is it budgeted explicitly or part of another program like IT, analytics, or innovation? So I think this is probably Okay, we had a technology pause there. So yeah, obviously I think Vishal, you'd be a great person to answer this question. You know, it seems like your hospital and your system has invested in specific resources to help operationalize and do discovery and development for these programs. Can you comment on, you know, how that came about and you know, exactly what, you know, what are the day-to-day things that, you know, your team performs, what functions?
Yeah, so I mean, just structurally speaking, first to answer the the main question. Structurally speaking, we are part of the IT organization, but within IT we have the this innovation slash transformation group, which is where we fall under, and AI program is a component of that. Obviously, the overall transformation program. Yeah, in terms of how we started, how do we think about funding, and obviously continue to prove value add, so on and so forth. So as I mentioned, we first started our journey in around 2017 or so. We realized that there are a couple of use cases out there that where it makes sense to have have an AI application associated with it. And fortunately, with some of the early successes we had, we recognized in early 2018 that we probably need to make a big bet around it. And ultimately, we brought on a number of different technology capabilities along the way at that time as well. And then now, roughly speaking, we're around 35 to 40 different initiatives that are AI specific. And when you add on mobile, web dev, and all that, that number certainly increases it dramatically. So what's allowed us to kind of continue to grow at the pace that we have, both in terms of the portfolio and also the team itself. And just to give you some frame of reference, we start out a handful of people, 3 to 4 people, to now almost close to 40 people. That's made up of 4 disciplines: program management, data science, development, and clinical expertise. And what's been a key driver of this growth overall is tying all the work we do back to our ultimate goal of the program. So one is to democratize the technology. We fundamentally believe that the limitation of these technologies is not necessarily a technical wherewithal. Yes, that's part of it for sure, but especially when you think about it in healthcare, it's just people developing intuitive nursing and how to leverage these technologies. That's one goal. The second goal is we're very focused on solving fundamental problems that we haven't been able to solve with traditional means. So our goal is not to go into a particular situation saying, hey, we have this RPA technology or we have this ML model. Can you tell us what is the appropriate use case to apply this against? It's quite the contrary, which is tell us what your fundamental problems are. We'll figure out whether we can build it or buy it. And the third thing is anything and everything we do, tying it back to the earlier points that were being made, is it has to have tangible benefit in our operations. Our goal is not to be an R&D job necessarily.
Right.
Our goal is to be value positive. And quite frankly, right now, we're generating an ROI around 350 to 400%, creating a net value of $20+ million on an annual basis. And it's specifically, this framework and discipline that has allowed us to grow at the pace that we have.
Yeah. I think, just to echo that, I think having that structure that you're talking about, it started out smaller, but, it grows as the value increases. And so, that structure doesn't, just sit within IT, although it is housed within IT in our organization as well. We have very, very close ties, and then even dotted lines, but very close ties to, our innovation center, which is a separate entity, and it, has all the project managers for innovation, the legal experts for innovation, compliance experts for innovation, like I was mentioning, and then obviously people from our strategy departments, as well as the business offices, are all very tied into, how this gets developed and how it's supported and supported, throughout its life and optimized, frankly. I know that, Ylan, Mark, Marks, you guys all, are obviously very invested in AI, as this is probably your primary goal for your company. I'm not sure if anyone else is interested in making a comment about, where, the investment for your company into AI and versus, other initiatives.
Sure. I think from a, what we noticed within the company is, even a few years ago, so I was building up my data science team, and I think at the time I was spending a lot of my time with other executives and others in the organization, just really educating them on what AI was, how it could really help in healthcare. And sometime after that point, the CEO of our company talked about AI being a strategic initiative. And I think having that level of support was really the inflection point. And, what I found is that unless your company or, if you're working in a hospital, you have to have senior level leadership that are bought in. And it really has to, I think, not only be driven by your technical teams, but also by your C-level executives. And I think if you have that, you should be able to be successful, and that you have kind of the backing, the budget to succeed. And then I think the other area that's been very helpful is my team is not a centralized team, so we're actually embedded within our business units. And what that does is it helps your data scientists really create a high level of subject matter expertise. Yeah. And that in turn helps them implement things that, are much faster. They have a good, I'd say, clinical knowledge understanding. And we found that it works out just infinitely better than necessarily just having a kind of like a centralized team, because they have that knowledge, they've developed the relationships, and they have that trust with their end stakeholders.
Yeah, in the context. That's a really good model. Yeah. Mark, I see you're looking to comment. Mark Seraphim.
Yes. Yeah, so I would, funnily enough, I would say like I sort of have the opposite problem that you have, where like the entire focus of the company is around machine learning. Like the company was developed to make machine learning models run faster and more efficiently. And so that's definitely not something we need to get buy-in at any level. Like that's like everyone's goal is to make sure that happens. I think like our challenge is more around like, well, like do we understand like the use cases around drug discovery? Because like I myself, when I run a machine learning model on some drug discovery workload, I can't like interpret the output. Like if it's a protein, like I somehow have no idea what I'm looking at. And so I do need to actively work with like a customer and be like, okay, well, does this make sense? Is this helpful? And sort of like this sort of communication is what's been like super valuable for me personally and for the
Exactly. No, that's exactly a comment I was making. We, in the hospital side are developing structures to support the implementation of this, but we also need to sit down with the developers of AI. And to Vishal's point, do we buy our solution or do we create it in-house? Those are the kinds of conversations that, I think every hospital is having, anyone where their senior leaders are interested in implementing this. So yeah, I think there's just going to be more and more of these conversations happening, and they're critical for the success of AI, I think. I think we have one more question left. Where do you see AI taking healthcare over the next 5 years? Oh, this is a big one for only a few minutes left. So let me see if we can circle. I feel like I've hit a rhythm here. I'll start with Vishal and then we'll move down because that's sort of how you guys are lined up on my screen here.
I'll tie back to my the comment that I made when we were starting the discussion. I think it's going to be indistinguishable from any other kind of software applications you have. And quite frankly, that wouldn't be the right way to have an AI application, where you shouldn't be thinking whether this is an AI application or a general software. I think the moment we get to that stage, that's when we really know that this is becoming an integral part of what our everyday professional activities as well, not just personal consumer activities.
Yeah. Marco, do you have a comment about where you see AI going for the next 5 years in your lane?
Yeah, I mean, real quick. I mean, I think it's what we've already sort of talked about, right? I feel, and we see evidence that more and more devices are becoming enabled, more and more important procedures or access is becoming online, becoming more remote, right? So over the next 5 years, it's going to continue to increase. So from an AI perspective, we're going to rely on that from a cybersecurity perspective, and we need to be able to do that in a way that privacy is maintained, and for the patients. And I don't think there's any escaping it. So it's going to happen, and it's just a matter of applying good cybersecurity hygiene in tandem with good hospital practices as these things become more and more internet enabled. And if we do that successfully, I think I honestly think it'll be a quicker and faster way of getting things done, but it has to be done in the right way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Doing it the right way is going to accelerate the adoption. Mark Serafim, do you have a comment on that, on your future?
Yeah, like I definitely agree with Vishal's sentiment that it's going to be indistinguishable from software. It's just going to be like a core part of any software engineer's studies. But I would also add to that, like sort of similarly to how like controlled randomized trials became part of the med school curriculum, I would argue like basic data analysis will be as well, like as more of these inputs will be digitized. And if we want the models to be faster so doctors can try them out, try out assumptions, see what works, make sure the models get more interpretable. So it'll sort of be like, I guess, like in addition to textbooks and domain expertise, it'll just be there. And I think in a couple of years, like we put like the question will be very obvious in hindsight, I believe.
Yeah, it'll be seamless. And I agree. I think trainees will become more involved in technology for sure. I think that has to happen. Ylan?
I think it's definitely going to change just the practice of medicine. And I think it's going to change it much faster than it has probably in the last 50 years. So that's one area that I see change. And I think the other area that I really see AI, just revolutionizing healthcare, is being involved in all aspects of a patient's health journey. So it isn't going to be traditionally, they go to a clinic, they go to a hospital. I think a lot of what is being done today could probably be done in the privacy of their own home, using an app-enabled device or some other IoT. And I think it's really going to push more of the focus on prevention and less of it, it's really not waiting until someone's condition has progressed too far where they do end up in the hospital. So I think overall it's going to be very beneficial. Of course, we're going to have to worry about, privacy concerns and I think security, to Mark's point as well.
Yeah, so I know we're supposed to wrap up soon, but I feel like there's a lot of things that are still pretty nebulous. And to our point earlier, we don't really know exactly what the future state is, but we do know there's key components to it. Including it needs to be seamless integration. Providers and users of AI shouldn't know that they're using it, so it has to be easy to implement. I think that it has to be accessible, make providers and folks accessible to medicine remotely. And that brings in the security questions. We need to definitely wrap security around this from the get-go. So, we don't have any major problems in implementation and adoption and regulation. I think that it's going to become seamless into a physician's kind of way they deliver medicine, to your point about, this should be taught early on, and we should start using this as part of how we deliver care. And then, just the back end operations, that's a low-hanging fruit to Vishal's point. And there's a lot of success stories waiting to be realized there. And they can make a huge impact to the healthcare industry, just, in the back office. So I think, we have a lot of things, in order, to really realize, the promise of AI. We have a lot of things to do. But I think collaborations like this, discussions like this really help us bridge, the gap and have some connections and some context for, what we're all doing and where we're working in this space. So I really thank you guys. I've learned a lot, and I hope that we continue to stay connected and we continue to have forums like these. I really appreciate AI4's opportunity for us to get together and discuss this.
Thank you so much. This has been a really awesome panel, and I've learned a lot too. So thank you all to all of our wonderful panelists. A big virtual round of applause from the audience. We're looking forward to continuing to network with you all through the networking opportunities at the conference. And if you're looking for your next session, you can check the agenda to find the next spot. So thank you all again. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you around.